This video is an introduction to the SAP Labs, the cash-to-cash business cycle for ERPsim, the manufacturing game. This video is specific to the textbook, the supplemental ERPsim SAP Labs and textbook, specifically the second edition. If you're coming across this video and you're not using this textbook, this probably isn't going to do a whole lot for you. You're welcome to watch, but it is specific to this textbook. So I'm going to do an introduction to all three labs, an overview of all three, and then some suggestions for success. So before you start, you do have to have this supplemental textbook, and it's this one right here. Make sure it is this edition. The earlier edition does not work with these labs. So make sure that you have that. I do recommend that everyone who is completing these has their own copy of the textbook. I've seen students attempt to do these labs sharing a textbook, and that doesn't work out quite as well. There's a lot of specific information, and if one person's maybe even a paragraph ahead, which again I kind of recommend that you all work together, but if somebody's a paragraph ahead, or you have to turn to the back to write some information down as required, it ends up getting challenging. So I recommend everybody has their own textbook for this. In addition, and this is not something that you as a student should be worried about, but your instructor does need to configure the SAP client to the extended manufacturing game. If that is not set, this will not work. So it does need to be set. There's a transaction to run that. And if you've never used SAP before, don't worry, just relax. The interface is a bit intimidating at first, but really these labs were written for people without SAP experience. I'm not expecting you to be even in the MIS IT field to really have a lot of experience within IT to really understand it. I'm not expecting experience as you're working through these. It's really designed for people who don't have SAP experience. So the first lab uses the manufacturing game client, but if you've used ERPsim before, a big difference is the simulation is turned off. So there's no automation, there's no strategy going through this. You're really going through and experiencing SAP and manually completing a number of the transactions that are automated within the simulation. The labs themselves, really, the biggest thing that we're looking for with these is helping you learn how to navigate SAP more quickly. So it's if you haven't used SAP before, this can be a little weird using it. There are a lot of options on each screen. Once you get through these labs, you should be a lot more confident in using SAP. It also helps you get familiar with the extended products, the extended manufacturing game products, which is the muesli products. In some ways, and depending on how your instructor is using the labs, it can give you some hands-on experience with some of the ideas or concepts that you've had in other classes. So something like procurement. If you've talked about procuring goods based on a bill of materials, this is the time to actually do it. So sometimes actually doing it makes a lot more sense than just talking about it. This also kind of gives you an overview of what's automated during the simulation. So you're manually completing all of these transactions. There's no automation within it. So it kind of gives you maybe some appreciation for what's automated in the simulation. But really, it's the overview. The biggest thing is navigating SAP. So if you get out of this and all you've done is learned how to navigate SAP more effectively, perfect. So it's not meant to enhance any kind of strategy once you get into the simulation itself. It may help with your strategic understanding of how the ERP system is working, but getting through these labs is not going to necessarily mean much when it comes down to winning or doing well within the simulation. How much you learn within these is entirely up to you. The labs, they've been used for years. Hundreds, if not thousands of students have worked through them. They are well written, time tested. If you take your time, you shouldn't have any issues with them. But if you're just looking at the screenshots and pressing buttons without really understanding it, well, you can do that because you do get the SAP navigation experience. But if you take your time and read and understand what's going on in the lab, it should broaden your business knowledge. So some of the, again, just like before when I was mentioning, if you've talked about procurement in a class, actually doing it puts a little bit more form to the thoughts. So seeing how something you learned in this class affects something you've learned in another class and how they're intertwined. So these are the kinds of things you could learn within these labs, but again, navigation experience is the bare minimum within it. Really just getting through these should lend itself to more effective gameplay once you get into the strategy side of ERPsim, because you're not fumbling through SAP. You should have the navigation side of SAP down once you get through these. This is the cash-to-cash business cycle. This is a buzzword within ERP. This is something that is resume worthy. So quite literally, you get through these labs and you can add this to your resume. You've been through the SAP cash-to-cash business cycle. Add it to your resume. It doesn't mean you know everything about ERP. It doesn't mean you're certified, but this is a big deal. So the reason for that is most people don't have any kind of formal SAP training. So they start a position where the organization uses SAP, and they're given really transaction training. It's what they need to know for what it is that they're doing. They work within 1, 2, maybe 3 transactions all day long. They stick to their task, they stick to their process, and they don't, or really can't, venture out beyond that. By doing this full cash-to-cash business cycle, it's implying multiple transactions, multiple functional areas. You're working within multiple departments. You're really hitting a lot within SAP. So this is the kind of thing that when employers see that you've been through the cash-to-cash business cycle, they know that you've understood and been through a lot more within an ERP system than most of the people that they are interviewing. Labs 1 through 3, this is an overview of the labs. You have your own company. It is the Muesli Manufacturing Company. You have an ERP system. It's SAP. It is certainly arguably, but the largest for sure in market share of the ERP systems out there. It is set up for best practices through all of the processes that you'll be going through, but that's all you have. So you start out with no inventory, you have some cash. What you need to do is produce and sell your product. That's the cash-to-cash part of the cycle. So you're forecasting, producing, selling, shipping, and all the related bookkeeping. And do keep in mind that more than one person would be doing this in an actual organization. This is an overview of the cash-to-cash business cycle. So starting right here. So creating the forecast, how much of each product you actually want. Running MRP, or you can manually create a purchase order. This works through over in here, so you can manually create. You can convert the purchase order, post goods receipt. This is a lot of the information that is that you'll be doing within the labs. You'll be going through these transactions, posting the payments, and then actually doing the production process itself, confirming your production, actually having the sales order, creating delivery, creating the billing, and then doing the accounting. Within the automation, within the ERPsim, you really only have a few of these transactions that you're doing. The rest of it is completely automated. So you won't be running any of these other transactions within the simulation. Within the labs, well, some of the automated things you won't be doing. The rest of these, and it may not be the exact transaction, but you'll be doing the rest of these processes throughout. So within Lab 1, again, the simulation is turned off, so you won't be using that forecast here, create forecast. You'll be manually creating the purchase order. So it says right in the textbook, create 1,000 of your assigned product, and you're manually creating the purchase order and the production order. There's no MRP, material requirements planning, so there's no simulation. So within ERPsim, you use MRP to create the purchase requisitions, you convert those to purchase orders, and then it's sent off to the preferred vendor for each one of the raw materials, and then it is shipped within 1 to 5 business days. Within the labs themselves, you're actually calculating your own MRP. So the forecast is 1,000. You're looking at the BOM, the bill of materials, and this is the ingredient list, the recipes. And you're taking, for one product, and you're taking 1,000, so you want 1,000 finished goods times the ingredients within the bill of materials, and that's your required raw materials. You're going to manually create a purchase order. So again, there's no MRP, there's no purchase requisition. We're going right to the purchase order. Once you have completed the purchase order, you will accept shipment of the raw materials, and then you set the raw materials up for production. You're actually going to be doing 2 purchase orders, one for the food and one for the packaging, the box and the bag. Keep in mind, one person wouldn't be doing this. So you're throughout the labs, you're wearing many hats. Again, most people are using a few transactions every day. Someone that might be on the receiving side may only be using 1 transaction every day. So going across modules, doing a lot of different things, this is not realistic. So you'll be working across multiple functional areas, across multiple departments. So once the raw materials are acquired, you will then work on the production side, and you want to produce 1,000 of your product. There's not a whole lot you have to do within this. It's a simple transaction. You tell it you want 1,000. It pulls the raw materials in automatically because that's how the process is set up within the system. You then go in and confirm, and then you move them to the warehouse for sales. So that is lab 1. So we worked through manually creating, manually creating the purchase order. Here, you've received the goods, and you've gone in and you've created the planned production order, you've released the production order, you've confirmed it, and it is now available for sales. You do a lot within lab 1. Lab 2, you're going to sell everything. So you're going to create a sales order for all 1,000 units, and you're going to pick, pack, and ship. This is the full extent of lab 2, which seems very simple, but it's a lot of different transactions you have to run through. So labs 1 to 2, getting to lab 3, labs 1 and 2 have a lot of accounting going on, but we're not working on those within labs 1 and 2. Lab 3 is when you actually do the accounting transactions. You are paying for the raw materials, you're receiving payment for your sales order, and then you're investing in the company. Keep in mind for lab 3 that this is out-of-the-box SAP. There is no academic version of SAP. So in thinking about something like SOX compliance, the financial controls. If you think about it, do you think 3 people could be allowed in the same transaction? Well, the answer is no. It says it right there. It makes it so that only one person can be in there at a time. So processing the vendor payments, do you think you can do that for more or less than what the invoices shows? Well, the answer is no. So there are a lot of different things you have to do. So if you're working within a group, you have to keep track of some of these things where you can't all be in the same transaction at once. You have to take your time. That also means that if you're working in a group, the first person in has access to everything, and they can accidentally complete some of the transactions that someone else is supposed to do. So this isn't easy. It's not, it's not difficult. It's not like doing calculus, but don't plan on breezing through. There's a lot going on. If you remember your accounting classes, most people found them to be frustrating. Well, you're doing accounting. This is bookkeeping using SAP. So it's not necessarily easy, but it's not necessarily challenging. But you do have to take your time. Remember, with the labs, you get out of this what you put into it. As you run the transactions, it'll ask you to look at reports to see how things change. These reports are not necessarily there to help you complete the lab. They're there for learning. So it'll ask you to look at, in lab 3 as an example, the combined income statement balance sheet. That has nothing to do with actually completing the transactions. It's more so seeing how a change in this financial transaction changes the balance sheet or the income statement. Now, this is one of those things where, at the very least, you're getting the navigation experience, but if you understand what's happening within these labs, you may end up having a better understanding of the simulation once you get into the strategic side of ERPsim. So going into the labs, just realize that it might make sense to you. SAP it's not ordinary as far as something you're used to working with. The interface itself is not necessarily apparent, transparent. There's a lot going on. If it makes sense to you, if you think it's easy, that's fantastic. If it doesn't make sense to you, that's okay. It's not good or bad. If it's easy for you to figure out, your mind just works a little differently than other people. It doesn't mean anything is good or bad. It does not necessarily mean that in the future you're going to do better in the simulation, because this isn't strategic at all. It's really the navigation side of it and seeing how the transactions work. Remember, this is not designed for you. So you're using a textbook that has labs set up for you, someone who presumably has not used these transactions before, but it still is the full-blown SAP. This is quite literally out-of-the-box SAP installed on a server using the actual transactions. So it's not really designed for someone who's learning. So make sure you're using the textbook, because the textbook is there to teach you what you're supposed to be doing, what you should be looking at. But SAP itself is not going to help you with that. So the labs themselves are not necessarily real world. keeping in mind that one person would be doing one or two transactions. And this you're using all these transactions. So thinking about the simulation, the games versus the labs, in the games, the minutia is automated. A lot of the financial transactions, the receipt of raw materials, all of those things are are run within the simulation. They're taken care of for you. There are some custom transactions in the simulations. They start with a Z. Anything in SAP that starts with a Z is a custom transaction, but they're there really as reports or for doing things as you're spoofing the system. Remember, SAP, this is out of the box SAP, so the simulated passage of time really doesn't exist within SAP. It's always a 1 day. But as you're simulating an entire round of 20 days, well, you sometimes have to have those Z transactions to make that come through. So again, in SAP Labs, there's no automation, there are no Z reports, no transactions. You're literally manually creating everything. So again, thinking through the typical SAP user in the real world, they have a few transactions they're using, probably within one module. They're not working across multiple modules. And if you think about it, if one person is spending their entire day working in a handful of transactions, SAP is really not set up to give them confirmations. They want to move quickly through their transaction because they know what they're doing. So they're running the same thing over and over and over, and you're only doing it once. You may say, well, it sure would be great if it gave me feedback. And they're saying, well, that's just going to slow me down. So there's very limited feedback as you're running these transactions. They're expecting you to want to move quickly between the different functions, and it assumes you know what you're doing. So don't expect error messages to pop up. Don't expect confirmation messages. A lot of the things we've gotten used to in some of our productivity software and in the apps, it's really not there for someone to be moving quickly. This is meant to be used quickly. So the people who know these transactions zip through them very quickly, and they don't want to be slowed down with extra confirmation or messages or anything like that. So realize this is not the academic version of SAP, this is the full-blown SAP. So this is real world in many ways because it is SAP. It has many options within each transaction. It will end up doing more than you'll really require within the labs, which is why the labs are set up in a way where it's a screenshot and it's an arrow pointing specifically to where you need to be, because there are, let's say, 1,000 different options within the transaction, and you need about 3 of them. So there ends up being complexity to it because there's so much that can be done. Some people think it's intuitive. Most people do not. It's eye of the beholder, of course, for that. So you keep all of this in mind. So the reason why I'm spending so much time explaining what to expect within the labs is really it's the proper framing within it. It should improve the experience that you have. Just knowing that you're using out of the box, it's not that there's something wrong with SAP, it's more so you just don't know what you're doing yet. So hopefully your experience should be improved. It should also allow you to accept it if you don't get it. That's all right, just get through the labs. Again, the navigation is the biggest piece of it. If you take the time, if you run through the labs a couple of times, you might get a little bit more, but it's okay if you don't. You really don't have to understand every aspect of this once you get into the simulation side of things. If you make a mistake, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. Really open your mind as you're going through it. There's a lot that you can learn within it, but you'll get out of it what you put into it. If you're getting it, that's a good thing. This is resume worthy. Again, the cash-to-cash business cycle is something that employers look for. Even if you're not going into an IT-specific field, the end user within an organization using ERP still has to use ERP. So this is, regardless of what you're planning on doing, if you're working within business, knowing the cash-to-cash business cycle is a good thing. It is resume worthy. And if you get it, and if you really get it, that's good. That's even better for your resume. And overall, this is inviting you to slow down. This is not a race. There's no reason why you need to rush through it. Take your time. I can tell you that from hundreds of students that I've personally had go through these transactions, go through these labs, the people who are rushing, the people who aren't reading are the ones who are making the mistakes. So slow down, take your time. All of the labs have information leading into the lab itself and before each transaction. So the intro itself sets up what you're doing. If you're jumping in, you don't really have any background. Again, take your time, read through it, read the text. Sometimes within the textbook, the screenshots tell you what to do. Sometimes the screenshots tell you where to go, and the text tells you what to do. So a lot of times it's the text explaining it, or it has more info. And this is where I see people who are rushing through these. They end up making mistakes because they're just looking at the screenshots, they're not reading the text, and they miss something. They miss what they're supposed to be doing. So again, slow down. Remember that these are processes. I've mentioned this a few times. This is a very important part in going into these labs. One person would not be doing this. So one person would not be working from the very beginning of the first lab, working all the way to the end of the third lab in the real world. So this is not real world, and it is real world all at the same time. So a large company would have multiple departments. The process itself, there'd be individual tasks that would pass from one person to another. Just remember, one person would be using maybe 2 or 3 transactions, 2 or 3 screens all day, probably working within one module. So again, keep in mind, this is not designed for students. It is not designed for student learning. This is quite literally out-of-the-box SAP, and multiple people would be learning this. If you struggle with Lab 1, that's fine. SAP, the interface for SAP is a bit weird. Some people get it. I've not seen any kind of a correlation between the people who get through the labs easily, doing well in the long run, versus people who struggle, not doing well. I would say that there's equal all the way around. Some people do a little better at slowing down and actually reading the instructions, and they don't make the small mistakes that end up causing big problems. But that doesn't mean anything in the long run. That doesn't mean that the strategy part works. If you are working within a classroom to complete these, I'd suggest that you try to, depending on how much time you have, maybe try to do Lab 1 in class, do Lab 2 out of class. Lab 2 is the easiest of the labs, and I do that in quotes, it's easiest. But Lab 3 is the hardest. If you have an option for completing the labs in a classroom setting with an instructor or someone who is helping you, able to help you, I recommend you get as much finished of Labs 1 and 2 outside of your class and then work on Lab 3 in class. If you have a couple of weeks, try to get Lab 1 in 1 week, Lab 2 out of class, and Lab 3 in class. Lab 3 is the one, it's hardest, and again, these are in quotes. Some people don't think it's hard, but there's a lot of attention to detail. So if you struggle with Lab 1, you're probably going to struggle with Lab 3. Try to work on Lab 3 when you have some sort of instructor support. For everyone completing the labs, I don't recommend starting and stopping. And I could even get to the point where I say don't start the labs if you can't finish it. So the instructions presume one sitting for each lab. That doesn't mean that you have to do Labs 1 through 3 all in one sitting. It means Lab 1 from beginning to end really should be completed at one time. The reason for that is it's assuming you are following the instructions, which means that if it says use this date and you started on Tuesday and then you pick up halfway through and on a Thursday and it says use today's date, well, the dates are wrong. So you have to keep track of which date you used for them. And sometimes it's using the other day's dates and sometimes it's using today's date. It's easier just to do it all at once. In addition, SAP presumes that when you're moving from transaction to transaction, you're working on the same document. So there's an autofill from transaction to transaction. Some of the document numbers pop through. Well, the labs themselves are set up presuming that this is happening. So if you log off and log back on a couple of days later, those things aren't coming through. So my recommendation is if you don't think you can finish the lab within the allotted time that you have, don't start it. Give yourself enough time to get through the labs at any one sitting. Labs 1, 2, or 3. If you're working within a group, this is really designed to be a group project. And the reason for this is some classes only have a handful of students, and that's fine, but a lot of classes have 30, 40, 50 students in it. If you only have one instructor or one person who's helping with the labs, that is too much for one person. If everybody's raising their hands for a question, by the time that one question is answered, everybody's sitting and waiting. So it's really, if you're in a larger class, working within a group is the best scenario. 3 to 4 people in a group is good. 5's too many. 2's not too bad, but 3 or 4 is the optimal. The idea then would be working in a group. When you get stuck, instead of raising your hand and asking your instructor or sending an email or however your support for this is working, you can ask your group first. So you have an issue and you say, well, this just happened. What should I do next? As a group, you try to figure it out, and then you contact your instructor for help. So then it's 3 or 4 people within a group who have a question and not one person. Especially in bigger classes. In a smaller class, it may not make a difference, and that's entirely up to your instructor. Also remember that the labs themselves have been time tested. They have years of experience. Hundreds, thousands of students have gone through them. Oftentimes the answers are within the text. So if you are stuck, if you can't figure something out, the answer may be within the text, and it may be something where you missed an instruction a few pages before, and you just need to go back to see it. So again, oftentimes the answers are within the text. Some successful tactics that I've seen with groups: literally work as a group. Every time I see a group do this, they really don't have problems. It takes a little longer, but there are fewer questions in the long run. So working as a group, everyone works together. If you have 3 people, 4 people in your group, everyone types and clicks at the same time. Everyone agrees on the next step. If there ends up being a question for the instructor, the entire group has a question. The very first time that I did this, when I said, well, I'm putting everybody in groups and work with each other, there were about 50 students in the lab. I think that worked out, 15, 16 groups. So there was one whole group. They were working. They didn't ask any questions. And then all of a sudden, at one point, 4 hands went up. And I walked over, and they all had the exact same error message on their screen. And I said, wow, this is amazing. Just click OK. And they all clicked OK and went on and did not ask another question. This really makes a big difference. And yes, it does slow things down if you have one member of your group who is a little slower getting through it. Everybody has to wait for that person. But it's a lot better than having the person who's moving ahead be 20 pages ahead or finished, and then you have to go back and work with the person who's a little slower. So it can slow things down, but it is far fewer issues. So if you're working as a group, I highly recommend that you literally work as a group. Another piece of this is recognizing learning styles. The textbook itself is visual. You have to read it. And if someone is having trouble reading the instructions, and if you're working as a group, you may try reading the instructions. Some people need to hear the instructions, not read them. If someone's getting frustrated, take a break. The very first time that I did SAP Labs, I did not have people working in groups. They were all working individually, and people were getting so upset because they were waiting for me to get around the entire class to answer questions. One person was so upset he literally kicked a chair across the room. No, don't do that. It's not that bad. It's just SAP Labs. So take your time. If you're getting frustrated, take a break, walk around, whatever. Just slow down and recognize that if you're working within a group, some people may be working at different levels than others. And really slow down. This is not a race. You should have a couple of weeks to complete all 3 labs. You might have a little less time for the first lab or the first 2 labs, but you should have a couple of weeks, many days to get through this. Plan your time. Give yourself a couple of hours per lab. If your group is working together, slow down and you'll probably finish early. If I say 2 hours per lab, if you guys are working slowly, if you're reading the instructions, you may be finished in a lot less time than that. But again, there's no reason to hurry through these. In working in the labs themselves, if you have not worked with ERPsim before, this is an important lesson. So your sim letter, your sim ID, the login ID that you were given by your instructor tells you your company letter. So if you have been assigned A1 or A3, A5, or B1, B2, B3, the A is your company A. If you're B, your company B. Within the instructions, and this is within the SAP Labs, within the supplemental textbook, and also within the job aid, once you actually get into the simulation, the company letter is signified as the $sign. So if you see the instructions and it says $sign once, it's just A. If you see $sign, that's AA, if you're company A. So whatever your company letter is, the $sign is the representation for that. This is explained within the supplemental text, but it's something for you to know going into it. Seeing the instructions within the supplemental textbook, you may follow the screenshots. Don't do that. Make sure you're using your company letter. So however your instructor has this set up, within my classes, my recommendation is having something like this, where you have your group, you have your company letter here, your actual user ID, and then this is the material that you're going to be creating. This makes a little bit more sense once you get into it. So just so you know, the $F01, the material code is the nut muesli, the 500-gram nut muesli. So if this is you and you were assigned this, you will see within the instructions $pound, that's A1, so $F0 pound is AA-F01. You can see that, A1, AA-F01. If this doesn't make complete sense to you, it will by midway through Lab 1 for sure. So you should be assigned a company code, your SIM ID, material code, and then you should have some sort of a label for your product. So only use your product within these. Your product ID corresponds to your data. So if you are A1 using material, you'll be using material AA-F01. The screenshots, however, consistently show ZZ-F06. So that's user Z6. That means it's company Z, and the product F06 is 500-gram mixed fruit muesli. These are the screenshots. Unless you have been assigned ZZ-F06, do not use this. If you are A1, A3, B1, use the material code that corresponds with your user ID. So don't follow the screenshots, follow the required data. Again, the $sign is your company letter, the pound sign is the number from your SIM ID, and that goes through to make your material code. If you don't use your ID, your data is thrown off. And it may be something like if you try to put in ZZ and your company C, it will tell you, well, you don't have access to that. And if you're not sure why you're getting that error message, well, that's why I'm telling you now. So that if you see those kinds of things, it's probably because you're using the wrong material code. Excuse me. If you're using not your ID, you might get erroneous results. So it may go through and then you get a few pages along and things don't work. If you look at page 17 of the supplemental textbook, this is within Lab 1. At the very bottom of the page, it says type all required food materials $$R XX. So this is, you have looked at the bill of materials and you figured out which raw materials you need. We have to make sure that you're doing the $$, which is your company code. R, those are raw food material. And then the XX is the two additional numbers. So it might be 0, 1, it might be 1, 1, depending on what your instructor has assigned to you. But you have to put in yours. Sorry, the RXX is for the raw material, which is not assigned to you. It's actually within your bill of materials. Sorry about that. So as you're going through and looking at the bill of materials, you will find out which materials you're putting in. And that is on page 14. So you can see at the top, the screenshot there is the bill of materials for ZZ-F06, 500-gram mixed fruit muesli. And you can see that it includes a number of different raw materials in a box and a bag. This is what you're going to be typing in on that transaction within on page 16. I'm sorry, on page 17. So you're going to be you're going to be basically ordering each one of the materials. The bill of materials there shows you what it is for one. You're making 1,000. You will be ordering. This is your grocery list, essentially. The quantity itself is based on the 500 gram or 1 kilogram size. So you can see in the screenshot it's a 500 gram. And if you were to add up all of the raw materials, ZZ-R01 through ZZ-R06, you would see that all that quantity there equals 0.5 or half a kilogram. So if you were doing the half kilogram, your raw materials will add up to 0.5 kilograms for one, and then you'd have one box and one bag. If you're doing the 1 kilogram, it will add up to 1 kilogram plus one box, one bag. The relevant information form is on the very last page of the book. It's on page 136. This is where you'll record information throughout the labs. This is referenced within the labs. If you look at page 21 of the book, you'll see there's a gray area, and it says, "The following is not busy work nor information only." I don't know why, but I always have at least one student who doesn't think they need to do this. And then they get to lab 3 and they have to go back and figure all of this out. But this is where you're recording some information. For the first couple of labs, it ends up being information that it makes it easier to troubleshoot in many ways, or if you have to stop for some reason and go back in, you have access to that information outside of SAP, so you don't have to find it. But it is required once you get into lab 3. So this is not something you can just skip. So this is information within the labs, across the labs. It says mark the page now. It should be the very last page. It shouldn't be that hard to mark it. But you will refer back to this within each lab. So again, good for troubleshooting labs 1 and 2, required for lab 3. There are some lab updates. This isn't quite an update. It's just a weird thing that happens. On page 47, if you are completing this after 5 p.m. Central Time, there's no explanation for it. I've been told by the University Alliance's SAP people that it doesn't happen, or it shouldn't happen, but it does. You may get an error if you use today's date after 5 p.m. Central Time. You just need to use tomorrow's date. And it says it within each lab. Well, so you can see on page 47, right in the middle, it says if you are completing this lab after 5 p.m. Central Time, you may need to use tomorrow's date. So just watch for that. If you're working before 5 p.m. Central Time, not a problem. It just works. So it's closing books or something. I don't really know what it is. The next one is page 63. Now this is the original release of this textbook. If you've purchased the textbook, I think it was November of 2016 that it was updated. But anyway, on page 63 of the textbook, there are some instructions that are out of place. So if you're looking at page 63, the screenshot should actually be below the text. So it should say transaction code F-53 and then show the screenshot that's above it. If you have an updated textbook, and you can tell if you have this by looking on the very first page of your textbook, if after second edition it says R2, this has already been fixed. So if you have this R2 on your textbook, it has been fixed. There are a lot of little errors here and there, nothing that was really a problem, but just little things. And then this was the big error that was fixed. And if you have the up-to-date version, it's all been fixed. No need to worry about it. But if you have an earlier version, make sure that you note that on page 63, the instructions for the screenshot take place after the screenshot. So just look at that first. So if you are not working within a lab with an instructor and you're wondering where to start with this, you've just been given the labs as a homework assignment, and you need to just jump in, where do you start? Well, if you don't have a specific place to start on page 1, logging on to SAP. You should at least have from your instructor the server, the client, the user ID, the temporary password, and your product, your assigned product. If you don't have those things, contact your instructor, however they have passed them through. Once you have all of those, starting on page 1, logging on to SAP, you should be able to just get started. Logging on to SAP is presuming you've never logged on before. you're not really sure what to do with SAP, so work through that section. The next one is navigating, and then it jumps right into the labs. So work through all of those. And again, don't work on lab 1 until you are sure you have enough time to complete it. So complete labs 1 and 2 before starting lab 3. That is an important piece. You have to complete them. Lab 3 won't work. Lab 2 won't work without successfully completed lab 1. But before you start lab 3, watch the lab 3 video. And the reason for that is it's specific to some of the accounting things that are going on with it, some specific instructions that are kind of special for lab 3. It's a pretty quick video. It's not as long as this one. This one really sets up jumping in for the very first time. Make sure you watch the lab 3 video before you get into that one. A nice break in between, just kind of remind you of what's going on. It could be, once you've gotten through lab 1 and lab 2, your brain might be a little fried. So make sure there's some time between them. Watch the video to just kind of remind you what you're in for within lab 3. If you have other questions, you can't find what you need to get started, well, if you have a group, work with your group, and if you don't have that information, make sure you contact your instructor. And that's it. Good luck. Slow down. It's not a race.